Sorry about that. So I'll start off the presentation in interest of time. So my name is Shabana Ali, and I want to tell a story. I hope everybody's interested in a story of how, as a PCN, we used something innovative to screen for AF during the pandemic lockdown. So we used something called Fibricheck. I don't know how much of you are familiar with the word, so I'll explain a little bit about Fibricheck. Next slide. So it's basically, Fibricheck is a smartphone application, and it is used to monitor the heart rate, heart rhythm, and to track symptoms. And what it does, it detects cardiac arrhythmias, including atrial fibrillation, and prevents debilitating, hence the strokes. It's certified as a medical device. It's been used in Europe, the US, and Australia, and it's so far been used over 500,000 people and has been prescribed, used by over 2,000 clinicians. Next slide, please. So the way it does it, it's a very clinically validated tool, and it uses the smartphone technology, tablet, watch, and the way it's done, you place this finger on the camera and that detects the activity. Next slide, please. Next. So a lot of you might be aware of CardioMobile, which is shown in the picture down below. You can see that you have to place your fingers on the CardioMobile. It's also a lead 1 ECG. So you just see lead 1, so it's not a 12-lead ECG, but the sensitivity and specificity of it is kind of similar, if not better, than CardioMobile. So basically you use it as a screening device, and after doing that you will still need a 12-lead ECG to validate AF. Next slide. So how did we do it in practice? Next slide. What we did was we asked practices for expression of interest. So in our PCN, we had 11 practices. We had an onboarding session with them where we identified AF practice leads, including practice managers and admin. All the practice was invited. This session was done at basically a backup of an existing COVID meeting. As you could see, in September, we're still sort of gearing towards our flu clinics. And it was quite a busy time. But the way we actually pitched it was, if you had a way of diagnosing or screening AF, in our flu clinics, we historically do pulse checks. And that was the thing, that was the challenge of the time. Because of the pandemic, you could not do that. And social distancing, another challenge. So how could we do that? So that was the reason why we asked expression of interest. And I was pleasantly surprised that the whole PCN 11 practices agreed to go ahead with it. Next slide. So the way we implemented it, we told them that it would be detected, monitored, and followed up as part of the vaccination outreach clinic. That would be a good way, because patients would be coming into the flu clinics where we used to put our hand on their fist and infection control and whatnot. That couldn't be done. That would be sort of summarized, like shortened in a way. It will be entailing just handing out a leaflet which would have the QR code, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go along. Before we actually did this agreement, we had the data sharing agreement with the practices. We also said that we will data share at 3 months to see how practices were doing, and also at the end of March. So the project started in September with the flu season, but it wasn't until October when actually the results started coming through. And then obviously everything was completed by a practice survey feedback. Next slide. So we had inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. We deliberately went for 50 years and plus, and said that if patients had suspicion of arrhythmias, 50 years plus, or they were at high risk using the risk stratifications tool, or they had palpitations. We were quite relaxed that. The only exclusion criteria was with patients that had existing ICDs or pacemakers, or they had Parkinsonism or dementia, because they would not be able to hold still and place their finger on the camera. And obviously, if they had tattoos and ink marks or calluses on their fingers, then the technology wouldn't work. Next slide, please. So distributing the code. So this is what the code looks like. So this is your QR code, as you can see, and this is what the practice, or we call it a prescription, is generated at the practice end. So it's linked per practice. So 11 practices have their own QR codes. So this is what we had in the flu clinic. So we did it two ways. We started off with flu clinics. So we just printed a mass of these forms, and we had them ready as patients were leaving the flu clinic. We gave them along, because in our initial cohort, we decided to target the over 65. So we already had the over 65 prime patients coming in at that time. So we did that, and under 65s and over 65s were done separately. So it was quite easy distributing the code. Next slide, please. The step 2 was that once the patient had the QR code, what would it do? The leaflet in itself was very good and explained it quite well, that you download the Fibricheck app, and using the QR code, it would just open up the screen where the patient would enter their name, date of birth, and particulars. And because through the QR code they would be connected, they would automatically be connected with their practice sort of feedback. But the patient just didn't go into anything apart from just entering their name, date of birth, and if the app prompted them, were they having palpitations, were they exercising or whatnot, the additional information. Next slide, please. So this is from the patient end. They entered themselves, they would do a PIN code. This is what the measurements would be. They would place their finger at the camera, and then straight away they would get a reading. They had to place their finger for 60 seconds. They could enter in some other additional information, and this is the reading that they would get back in real time. So the patient knew what it was. Next slide. So communicating the results. So once they have done that, so just to explain, so in the event of the patient having AF, you can see that there is a red. This is what the email would get. The practice would get an email and would be notified the next day that this patient has an episode of AF or a run of AF. And if it wasn't AF, because it does pick up trigeminy, bigeminy, ectopic beats, supraectopic beats or whatnot, then it would come out as an amber, and the practice would be notified the next day. Next slide. This is the report that looks when you open it, because you click on the report, and this is usually generated after 7 days. So we thought this was a very good screening tool if we were to take it on permanently as a screening tool, because with a pulse check, you just take that moment in time and check the pulse. Whereas in this, you kind of, once the QR is generated, it is active for 7 days. So we told patients to check their pulse twice a day or 3 times a day, and they could do it up to 7 days. After 7 days, the QR code would stop working, the app stops working. If you are all interested, you can download the app on your phones right now, and the first go is free anyway, and you would know what kind of a rhythm you are at the moment in. Next slide, please. I'll just quickly whiz up through the rest of the slides. So the learnings, what we had, so very important. So far to date, our project was for 6 months, and we are in March, so we conclude on the 31st of March. So far, we have screened 174 patients, and we have detected 7 patients with AF across our 11 practices. There were other arrhythmias detected, and there were about 37. So roughly 150 patients were reassured, and I see never underestimate the power of a negative result. and that could have been very, very reassuring for our patients. With COVID, with the pandemic, palpitations were through the roof, and I don't know how you're experiencing that at your end, but everybody has palpitations. So we had the practice level feedback was really helpful as well, because all clinicians unanimously agreed that it was a good way of detecting AF. And if we were screening for AF, it's not just in that moment in time, what about PAF? And if we did do 7 days of monitoring, that was equivalent to having a rough, don't quote me on this, a 7-day ECG. And just imagine how much powerful information you have that patient 7 days had a 60-second rhythm check, and they didn't have AF. And obviously you can change your treatment strategy, and you can also, the technology can allow longer monitoring, but for the purpose of the pilot, we only did it for 7 days. Patients found it very easy to do, the onboarding of the thing. So once the flu clinics finished, we wanted to do it in our practice just on a need basis, and we found that the patients really enjoyed it. Those people in a bubble, or those elderly patients who didn't do it, or had a grandson or a granddaughter or a carer coming in, they could use the smartphone technology like that. So even though we had some digital exclusion, still there was a way around it. Next slide, please. What did we achieve? Patient reassurance. It was a simpler way, empowering them. All of them got excited. I was really surprised. Over 65, 70-year-olds, you think that they don't know digital? They do know digital. I think the pandemic has revolutionized a lot of people around us, more than we think. But yes, it was a pure joy seeing that. It empowered GPs. It was a very frustrating, difficult time where our diagnostic timelines were a lot, and we couldn't get access to 24-hour ECGs or 7-day, let alone cardiology. Advice and guidance was the only one way forward. So we thought it really helped, and those good 160, 50 patients that we did not send forward, by just reassuring them, look, your heart rhythm is absolutely fine, was brilliant. So that was fine. And then the system, so you reduce the inappropriate referrals, you make resourceful allocation for those who need it most. Next slide. And I think we've finished. Any questions? Quite happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Shabana. It's really, really interesting, and congratulations for the great work you're doing. A couple of questions in the chat. So one question was, do you know what were the percentages of people who downloaded the app and checked their rhythm compared to the target screening population? Do you know?
So we haven't concluded the thing, as you can see, of 31st of March. So we haven't got that fine nitty-gritty data as yet. But this is the data we have, and we went along with that. But we will be looking at that and sharing that at a later time. Amazing,
thank you. And another question was, interested to understand the sensitivity or specificity for arrhythmias, and also the uptake as proportion of digitally excluded in the higher risk demographic. Again, I guess early for you to know at this point. Is that right? Yes, that's right. But like I said, we were very conscious of digital exclusion, so we looked at other ways of probably practice, community pharmacy, whether care homes, any other sort of community services where patients, for example, the LD patients, we could somehow include them, because everybody is very familiar to their phones. And there are ways of doing that. It's just about linking the code and then ensuring that they have access to that smartphone technology. Amazing. Okay, thank you. Probably one last question was, do you know the cost for 7-day access? Sorry? The cost for 7-day access to the... No. No worries. That's fine. Absolutely not. No worries. But yeah, we can get that information. So I think
we can take interesting questions back to the companies themselves. Just one last question from Beth Friedman. She just mentioned, you talked about reassuring patients about the results, but she was under the assumption that you were screening asymptomatic patients who didn't have symptoms. So the reassuring, is that coming from those that were picked up to have different arrhythmias that weren't AF? Is
Yes, absolutely. So we had a mishmash. So like we started off with just our asymptomatic flu attending clinics, and then we kind of had the technology for 6 months. So we thought, while we were in the pandemic, we couldn't do anything. Everybody, all those worried phone calls, palpitations, what do we normally do? How do we deal with them? And in lockdown, especially December that's when it was heavily used. December, when patients were absolutely in lockdown and still having palpitations, it was very reassuring. We could used Accurex as well to distribute the QR code, which was absolutely fantastic. So the patient didn't have to come to the practice. The Accurex code, they would print it at home and then use it. So that was quite helpful.
Great, thank you so much for that talk. It was obviously quite well received. Just to let everybody know that here at UCL Partners, we are actually working with the company Fibricheck. So if anybody does want to have any further conversations about how they can use the product themselves in their CCG, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us after the meeting. Just to quickly move on, we have a talk from one of our health technology advisors,